Hello again. This is lecture 7 of our summer school on consciousness and introspection, and the topic of this lecture and the last lecture will be introspection and illusion, and we'll see that illusion covers a lot of kind of related topics that we'll be going through. But let me begin, as I usually do, by recapping. So in the last two lectures, we were looking at the idea of revelation, which is the idea that in introspection you can come to know not just that you're in a certain state that is conscious, but what the essence of that state is. And I argued that that wasn't true. It's not true that we can come to know the essence of the states that we're in by introspection. We might come to know them in some other way, but not by introspection. And I also suggested that that idea wasn't presupposed in philosophical thought about the mind-body problem, and I expressed some skepticism about the question of whether it was presupposed in just ordinary thought about the mind-body problem, though that's a big empirical question, which I didn't broach all that much. I didn't get into all that much. But this issue about revelation kind of raises a more general issue, and that's the issue about what the possibilities are of ignorance and error in introspection. Can we make errors in introspection, and can we be ignorant of certain things in introspection? And so that's really the topic of today's lecture. Now, a good way to, I think, approach this general issue is to think about introspection as a kind of representational system. So right from the beginning, we've been thinking of introspection in a particular way. It's that distinctive way that we come to know that we're in conscious states. And I've been defending the view that there is such a distinctive way. So some people, like Dretsky, as I mentioned in lecture 3, kind of ends up denying that there is any distinctive way. But mostly I've been defending the view that there is. And when you think about that, the idea that there's a distinctive way that you come to know that you're in conscious states, well, on most ways of thinking about that, it's going to be that introspection is a kind of representational system. It's a sort of system according to which you represent yourself as being in certain sorts of states or not. So in that sense, it's a representational system. And in general, for any representational system, the possibility of ignorance and error will arise. So it can be the case, for example, of some representational system that it can represent something to be the case, and it isn't the case. That would be a case of error, when it represents something to be the case, and it isn't the case. Or again, it may alternatively fail to represent something to be the case when it is. That would be a case of ignorance, of not representing something that is the case. So think of the example of a doorbell. In Alex Burns' discussion of introspection, doorbells loom large. So let's take that example. Well, a doorbell, in a certain sense, is a representational system of who's at the door. If it dings, then it represents that there's somebody at the door. Well, it can represent that there's somebody at the door and there isn't somebody at the door. It can ding by accident. And likewise, somebody could be at the door and be pressing the buzzer, and yet the doorbell doesn't ring. And that would be a case of ignorance in a certain sense. So representational systems in general permit these possibilities. And in fact, there are further features of representational systems that it's worth bearing in mind. And this is that not only do they permit the possibility of ignorance and error, but they also have built-in limitations in certain ways. It's an interesting question whether, that this is just true of, as it were, all the representational systems that we could imagine having, or is it true of representational systems as such that they have these limitations? But they certainly seem to have limitations, and here are the limitations I have in mind. First, representational systems represent only some properties and not others. Some are just outside the purview of the system entirely. The system just doesn't have anything to say about them. And so we can think of these as the sort of target properties for any representational system. It says of these target properties that they are or are not instantiated, but there are properties outside of that class that it is just silent about. So it has a kind of restricted range of target properties. And secondly, a representational system will typically be limited in the patterns of instantiation that it can represent about these target properties, or the way that these target properties are distributed. So even restricting our attention to the target properties of some system, the system typically will only tell you some things about the distribution of those target properties and not others. And then finally, a representational system is typically limited in that it doesn't tell you all that much about what I think of as the second order properties of the target properties. And you can think of second order properties here as properties of the target properties, like, for example, whether the properties are intrinsic or not, or whether they're, compatible with materialism or not. These are second order properties of target properties, and typically a representational system will tell you only some of the second order properties, or perhaps none of the second order properties of its target properties. So it's limited in that way as well. If you think about perception, for example, then perception, I think, has all of these limitations, and it also, of course, permits the possibility of ignorance and error. Some people in the philosophy of perception think of perceptual relations as non-representational, but most people think that perception is representational, and in fact even people who think of it as non-representational think that those non-representational relations promote certain beliefs, so there's a kind of representational system in the background. But if we think for the moment of perception as a representational system, then it's clear that you can represent something that isn't the case. So that's a case of error. And something can be the case, and your representational system doesn't represent that it is, and that would be a case of ignorance. So it permits cases of ignorance and error. Moreover, on these three dimensions of limitation that I've just mentioned, those seem to be true in the case of perception as well. So, for example, we normally think that when you perceive an object, you are in a position to learn things about the object, perhaps because the perceptual state itself represents things about the object. But perception tells a very selective story about certain objects. So it says of certain objects that you see that they have a certain shape or a certain colour, or that they're in a certain position with respect to you, for example. But it doesn't say certain other things, like it doesn't represent, if I'm looking at a book, for example, it doesn't tell me I can't just tell by perception that the book is, owned by a university, for example. If the book is owned by a university, I can't tell that by perception. Now, there's a sort of a disagreement in the philosophy of perception about what the target properties of perception is. Sometimes this is called the problem of the admissible contents of perception, or sometimes it's also called the issue of thin versus rich views in the philosophy of perception. Thin people think that perception is somewhat limited in its target properties. It only tells you, let's say, about, colour, shape, position, a few other things perhaps. Others think it's much richer and you can represent in perception, that somebody is angry, for example. There's an interesting exchange between Alex Byrne and Susanna Siegel on this topic. But everybody, so there's a sort of a disagreement about, what exactly the target properties are in the case of perception. But everybody agrees that there are target properties in the sense that perception is limited in the class of properties that it can tell you about. What about the second dimension of the second limitation, that it only represents certain patterns of instantiation and not others? Well, here's a sort of a simple example. Suppose you're looking, consider two different displays. One display is just a display of 3 red objects against, let's say, a grey background. Perception of the kind that we have can easily distinguish between the case in which there are 3 red objects like that and only 2 red objects, let's say. It can easily distinguish between 2 and 3. But compare that with a case in which you've got, let's say, 1,003 red objects versus 1,002 red objects against the same grey background. Well, here we've got, if you like, the same properties. It's still a certain colour property that's being represented, but the pattern of distribution is quite different. And when you shift to the 1,003 versus 1,002, the perceptual system doesn't really discriminate in that case. It can't sort of distinguish between whether there's 1,003 and 1,002. It can be the case, of course, that you can, in a certain sense, see 1,003 versus 1,002, because if there is 1,003, then you see that, and if there is 1,002, then you see that. The idea is that the representational character of the perception is, it's quite plausible to say. It's not mandatory to say, but it's quite plausible to say in this case that the perceptual system doesn't discriminate that. So it tells you about some patterns and not others in the instantiation of the target properties. The example I just gave is a sort of variation of a number of famous examples in philosophy. One is the speckled hen, where you can look at a hen and you can distinguish certain of the speckles of the hen, but not if there's many speckles. And another example is, of course, Descartes' example of the 1,000-sided figure that you can't tell apart in perception from a 1,001-sided figure, something of that sort. And then what about the third thing about second-order properties, that perception considered as a representational system only represents some second-order properties of the target properties? Well, here's an example. In philosophy of perception, there's another dispute, which is about whether causation or causal relations are represented by perception or not. This is a question about whether causation is included in the target properties, of perception or not. And there's an issue about that. And I think a lot of philosophers these days think that causation is represented by perception. David Armstrong, who was my undergraduate supervisor a long time ago at Sydney University, used to try to prove that causation was represented in perception by walking up to you and pressing his finger against your top of your arm. He seemed to think that when that happened, you felt pressure in a certain way. He attributed this point to a French psychologist called Michotte. You somehow feel pressure, and he thinks that in the case of feeling pressure, you perceive causation. That was Armstrong's view. Well, as I say, that I think was a very controversial view. Hume actually thought, of course, that you couldn't perceive causation. That was a sort of crucial point about Hume, or at least Hume, as he's often represented, doesn't hold that view. But I think contemporary philosophers often do. But remember that there are lots of, as it were, second-order properties of causation that are much more controversial. Like some people think of causation as a special sort of higher-order relation among properties, let's say, whereas other people think of it as some sort of global pattern of regularities in nature. These are different theories about what causation consists in. Well, even if you thought that causation was represented in perception, you wouldn't think that the disagreement about these features about the nature of perception would be represented in perception. At least you needn't think that. So the idea is that you can't tell, in perception whether causation is a relation among second-order properties, or whether it isn't. It may be or it may not be, but it's not something that you can tell in perception, and that's because perception is limited in the sort of second-order information it gives about its target properties. So maybe perception might say, yes, this event caused that event, but it doesn't tell you what the nature of causation is. So that's the sense in which perception has all these limitations. And so a good question to ask about introspection is whether it too has these features, whether it too permits ignorance and error, and whether it too is subject to these sorts of limitations. I think it is, but I think we would need to illustrate that kind of slowly and look at examples as to why that is the case. Well, that's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to look at three topics within generally speaking, the philosophy of introspection that illustrate these properties of representational systems, that illustrate the capacity for ignorance and error on the one hand, and these built-in limitations. And I'm going to look at three areas. One is this idea of the denial of the appearance-reality distinction. It's quite common for people to say that. In fact, I mentioned last time that in one of Chalmers's papers about the meta-problem, he speaks of the Kripkean denial of the appearance-reality distinction. Well, regardless of whether Kripke in fact denied this, it's certainly a common thing to deny it. And if that were the case, then you might think, well, there would be no such thing as ignorance and error in respect of introspection. The second area I'm going to look at is a famous argument in the sort of general issue of self-knowledge and introspection, and that's Williamson's Anti-Luminosity Argument. I think that, in a certain sense, the reaction, the sort of response to that argument shows something about the limitations of introspection. And then finally, I'll look at illusionism, considered as a thesis in philosophy of mind. Illusionism is the view that, you're not really in conscious states, you just believe in introspection that you are. And thinking about illusionism, I think, is another good way of thinking about these properties of introspection considered as a representational system. These are three big topics, and we're only going to look kind of in a relatively superficial way at all of them. But I do think it's good to have them before us. In the final lecture, Lecture 8, I'm going to take up this issue of illusionism in more detail and look at an interesting discussion of it by Martina Niederrummelen, but I'm not going to do that today. I'm going to impose a kind of restriction as well on our discussion, and that is I'm going to limit attention only to two theories of introspection, the Acquaintance Theory and the Rationalist Theory. You'll remember right back from Lecture 1 that there's a whole bunch of theories about what that distinctive way that we come to know that we're in conscious states is, what that way is. One of them is the Acquaintance Theory, one of them is the Rationalist Theory. Those are the ones I'm going to focus on. That means I'm going to set aside various other theories like the Inferentialist Theory developed by Byrne, the various perceptual theories that Shoemaker rejected, and his own constitutivist theory, which is in some ways like the rationalist theory, but as I mentioned, it has its own problems. So I'm just going to focus on those theories for the present. So let me actually just begin with a kind of quick primer on what those theories are, just so that we're on the same page. You may have forgotten a bit about them with all of the discussion of revelation and other topics. Well, first of all, the Acquaintance Theory. Well, I think the key idea of the Acquaintance Theory, there are three key ideas, really. The first and main idea is that you're in a conscious state just in case you're acquainted with being in the state. So, if the conscious state in question is having a pain in your foot, then the Acquaintance Theory says that you've got a pain in your foot just in case you're acquainted with having a pain in your foot. The second idea connects the idea of acquaintance with a certain epistemological idea, namely having to use the phrase we introduced before, propositional justification for the belief, for a certain belief that you're in the state. So the second idea says that if you're acquainted with being in a conscious state, then you will have propositional justification for the belief that you're in the state. To have propositional justification doesn't mean that you believe that you're in the state. It means something like being in an epistemic position to hold that belief. Were you to hold the belief would be justified, but it doesn't mean that you do hold the belief. And the idea is that acquaintance with the conscious state is the thing that gives you that propositional justification. It is the thing that brings about this sort of epistemic fact. That's the second idea. And the third idea of the acquaintance theory says that, well, given certain conditions, suppose you're rational and suppose you meet certain background conditions, for example, you're capable of believing that you're in the state. It matters to you whether you're in the state, for example. If those conditions are met, then you will in fact believe that you're in this state if you're in it. That's the idea. That's the sort of third idea of the acquaintance theory. You can, as you might say, take advantage of that fact about yourself that you're propositionally justified to hold this belief, and then you, by forming the belief, and if you form the belief, then you've got something that will typically amount to knowledge. That's the acquaintance theory. The rationalist theory, as I've been imagining it, says something different. Its main idea, and its first and main idea, is that there's a principle of rationality called an introspection principle, and that principle says, well, if you're in a conscious state, then ... believe that you are. And as I said right in lecture 1, the ... the ellipsis, is supposed to tell us that there are lots of conditions in the background. You must be rational, you must be able to form the belief that you are in the state, and so forth. And the idea of this, the idea here is that there are various principles of rationality, and principles of rationality in general tell you about how the mind of a rational agent is organized. The mind of a rational agent is not one in which there are contradictory beliefs. The mind of a rational agent might be one in which there's a certain pattern of relation between intention and belief, between perception and belief, and so forth. Here the idea is that there's a pattern between conscious states and belief. Namely, if you're in a conscious state, then you'll believe that you are. The second idea of the rationalist view is that if you abide by this principle, to abide by this principle will give you a certain kind of disposition, a rational disposition, or perhaps a rational capacity, to believe that you're in a conscious state if you are, at least if the background conditions are met. So just as if there's a law, an empirical law, for example, that applies to an object, that it says that this piece of metal will expand when heated. Well, if the piece of metal obeys the law, that means the law applies to it, then if it'll have a certain disposition, namely to expand if heated. Likewise, if you abide by this principle, then you will have a certain rational disposition or capacity to believe that you're in a conscious state if you are. And the third idea is that if you're in a conscious state and you abide by this principle, then you can exercise this disposition. That is, you might come to hold the belief that you're disposed to hold in the circumstances. And if you do, then you'll have a kind of it'll be true because it's the belief that you're in the state and you are in fact in the state. And it'll be a justified belief, justified because it'll be the outcome of a rational process, a manifestation, if you like, of a rational disposition. And the belief in question will typically amount to knowledge. So that's the idea of the rationalist theory. It's an interesting question which we haven't actually talked explicitly about, which is what the relation is between the acquaintance theory and the rationalist theory. The answer is, I think, is that the rationalist theory doesn't so much deny the acquaintance view, but it just removes any reason to hold it. There's just no reason to if these ideas about the introspection principle and abiding by it and so forth are on the right track, then there's just no reason to assume that that we are acquainted with our conscious states in the way that the acquaintance theory says. That's one difference. And another difference is that though having said that, the acquaintance theory needn't, for example, deny that there's a principle of rationality of the kind that the rationalist theory says that there is. It's just that they will understand that as explained by acquaintance in a certain sense. And another difference, of course, is that the acquaintance theory, in its typical presentation, is very much limited to a certain kind of conscious state, namely a phenomenally conscious state, whereas there's no such limitation built into the rationality view. So those are the sort of two, I think, main differences. There are also some other differences which we'll come to. Okay, so let's then turn to our main questions, which are, if you think about introspection as a representational system, does it have these, can it permit ignorance and error, and does it have these limitations? Well, let's first start with the question of whether it can permit ignorance and error. Now, here's where the issue of the appearance-reality distinction comes in. You might think that introspection theories in general can't permit cases of ignorance and error because, with respect to consciousness, there's no such thing as an appearance-reality distinction. I mentioned before that Kripke is often said to deny this, but the person I think who really does deny it is Searle. This is a very famous passage from Searle's book, The Rediscovery of the Mind. Searle says, "Consciousness consists in the appearances themselves. Where appearance is concerned, we cannot make the appearance-reality distinction because the appearance is the reality." So generally speaking, if you get the impression reading a paragraph like this that somehow or other it would be a mistake to think that there's an appearance-reality distinction to be drawn in the case of consciousness, and then presumably that means that in introspection of consciousness or access to consciousness, again, we can't draw an appearance-reality distinction, which would seem to rule out immediately the possibility of ignorance and error. Well, that's if Searle's right, but what is Searle talking about in this passage? It sort of sounds good, but in fact it doesn't seem to amount to very much when you look closely at it. So let's consider this claim to try to bring out this. It appears to me that there is a wallet on the desk. It appears to me that there's a wallet on the desk. That's an appearance. So we just go back to Searle's passage. Consciousness consists in the appearances themselves. Where appearance is concerned, we cannot make the appearance-reality distinction because the appearance is the reality. So a good question to ask about this passage first off is, what is he talking about when he's talking about appearances and the appearance and so forth? What are these things, appearances, that he's talking about? Well, if we begin with this sentence, it appears to me that there's a wallet on the desk. That at least is a relatively straightforward sentence. In fact, it looks to be a psychological report. It appears to me that there is a wallet on the desk. It looks as if, to me, there is the subject of the psychological report. It, at the beginning of the sentence, is a sort of dummy subject. It doesn't, or what is sometimes called a pleonastic subject. It doesn't seem to have any semantic role. It appears to me that there is a wallet on the desk, looks to be a psychological report, analogous in many ways to, I believe that there is a wallet on the desk, or I imagine that, or fear that, if for some reason I was afraid. I fear that there is a wallet on the desk. It appears to me that there's a wallet on the desk. And if we can agree that reports of this kind are true sometimes, it does in fact right now appear to me that there is a wallet on the desk over there. So we can then think of an appearance, the appearance that Searle is talking about, as the state that I'm in when it is true that it appears to me that there is a wallet on the desk. Just as we might say, for example, suppose it's true that I believe that there's a wallet on the desk, then I would be in a certain state, a belief state, which makes that true. Likewise, if it appears to me that there's a wallet on the desk, might be in a certain state, which we can call, if you like, an appearance, that there is a wallet on the desk. And so what Searle seems to be saying is that at least if that's what we mean by an appearance, then we cannot draw the appearance-reality distinction with respect to that state because it is an appearance. That seems to be what he's saying. But that doesn't seem to be true in several ways. Can we draw the appearance-reality distinction with respect to the state that I'm in when it appears to me that there's a wallet on the desk? Well, yes, you can draw the appearance-reality distinction in several ways. I mean, for one thing, the state itself can be veridical or not. So if it appears to me that there's a wallet on the desk, we can go on to ask whether there is a wallet on the desk. And if there is, then the state that I'm in is a veridical state. And if there isn't, then the state that I'm in is not veridical. So the state itself we can seem to draw the appearance-reality distinction with respect to the state itself just by asking whether it's veridical or not. Likewise, we can distinguish the state that I'm in from the belief that I might have about the state. For example, I might believe that I'm in that state or not. Right now, it appears to me that there's a wallet on the desk. And moreover, I believe that it appears to me that there's a wallet on the desk. And we can ask whether that belief is true or not. And if it's true, then it looks as if we have, as it were, a case of a true belief about the appearance. And if it's false, then we don't. So again, we can draw the appearance-reality distinction with respect to this state. So it's just completely puzzling what Searle is talking about when he says that you can't draw an appearance-reality distinction with respect to this thing. Now, perhaps what he has in mind is that the notion of appearance here doesn't iterate. It can't be repeated in a relevant sense. So if we go back to 1, it appears to me that there's a wallet on the desk. The word appears only once, but we could iterate that and give us 2 here. It appears to me that there's a wallet on the table or on the desk. Sorry, I shifted from desk to table. Just ignore that. It appears to me that there's a wallet on the table. Well, maybe what Searle is saying is that we can't have iterated cases of appearance in this way. But in order to address that question, I think we'd need to ask whether the 2 occurrences of the word appears here, it appears to me, mean the same thing or not. That is, are the 2 occurrences to be interpreted in the same way or not? And here we confront the problem that the word appears has lots of different meanings, or at least two dominant meanings, or at least readings in English. Sometimes it means something like believes. So if I say, it appears to me that, there'll be a recession next year. It appears to me there'll be a recession next year. That is a way of saying I believe that there will be a recession next year. And sometimes it means a perceptual state, something like a perceptual state. For example, if it appears to me that there's a wallet on the desk, that can be true regardless of what I believe. I may have no inclination to believe that there's a wallet on the desk, even though it appears to me that there is. Because, for example, I realize that I've just taken a drug, and certain drugs induce hallucinations to the effect that there are wallets. Well, if that were the case, then it could appear to you that there's a wallet on the desk, and you wouldn't believe that there was. So the word appears can mean a kind of perceptual notion, or a cognitive belief sort of notion, or sometimes called a doxastic versus a perceptual use. Now, if it meant something like believes, at least in the first occurrence here in 2, then the only thing that 2 really means is that it appears to me just means I believe. So then all that's being said is that I believe that it appears to me that there's a wallet on the desk, and that seems to be perfectly appropriate. So that doesn't seem to work. If appears here in the first occurrence meant something like perceptual thing, some sort of perceptual notion of appearance, then in effect we would have backed ourselves again into into an inner sense theory of introspection, because the idea is that I'm in a state of it's appearing to me that there's a wallet on the table, and that state itself can appear to me to be, in a certain sense, where that appearance is a kind of inner sense notion. So maybe what Searle is talking about is that you can't do that. Well, that might be right, but that hardly tells us that we can't draw an appearance-reality distinction with respect to consciousness or with respect to introspection. So I don't think that we should proceed by looking at this Searle idea about appearance and the appearance-reality distinction. But there's another way in which we might want to deny the appearance-reality distinction with respect to introspection. And this is a sort of, in a way, much more straightforward thing. It's just to assert something like this, that S is in a conscious state C, if and only if S believes that S is in a conscious state C. So the idea is that, if you're in a conscious state, you believe it, and if you believe it, then you're in it. So you couldn't, on this view, have, for example, a false belief that you're in the conscious state because you believe it. If you believe it, it's true. Well, the thing is that neither the Acquaintance Theory nor the Rationalist Theory will accept this. They'll both agree that this claim isn't true. So on the Acquaintance Theory, for example, the Acquaintance Theory says that if you're in a conscious state, you're acquainted with being in it, but it doesn't say that if you're in a conscious state, then you'll believe that you're in it. That's just not part of the bargain at all. The Acquaintance Theory obviously permits that you can believe that you can be in a conscious state and fail to believe that you're in it. Moreover, there's nothing in the Acquaintance Theory to say that you can't believe that you're in a conscious state and fail to be in it. If someone could convince you for some reason or other that you're in the state, then that means that you believe it. It doesn't follow that you're in it. That's quite consistent with the Acquaintance Theory. And likewise, on the Rationalist Theory doesn't entail the left to right direction of this biconditional. It doesn't entail that if you're in a conscious state, you'll believe that you're in it. At best, it says that if you're in a conscious state and you abide by a certain rule and a lot of background conditions are met, then you'll believe. But that's a different matter entirely. And again, it doesn't deny that you could believe that you're in the state, but falsely. You believe that you're in the state because, somebody you trust told you, but it doesn't follow that you are. So neither of these views would deny the appearance-reality distinction in this way either. So neither the sort of Searle proposal about how to deny the appearance-reality distinction, or this very, very much more straightforward version, is something that any kind of acquaintance theorist or rationalist theorist would sign up to. Well, there's a third way that we might consider of denying an appearance-reality distinction, and that might be to assert not something more epistemic, like we can have an epistemic thesis as opposed to a psychological thesis. So we could have S is in a conscious state C if and only if S has introspective justification to believe that S is in a conscious state. What do I mean by introspective justification? I mean the kind of justification that you have when you believe by introspection that you're in a certain state. It's hard to make precise what exactly that is, but we can think, well, that's distinct from, let's say, testimonial justification or perceptual justification or some other sort of thing. And we could imagine a thesis that said, well, while being in a conscious state doesn't go together with believing that you're in it, it might go together with having a certain kind of introspective justification to believe that you're in the conscious state. Actually, ideas of this kind are discussed a lot in Declan Smithy's book, which I mentioned in Lecture 1, which is a long discussion in respect of introspection. He calls the simple theory, which isn't exactly the acquaintance theory, but operates in some ways like it. And he has a long discussion of this style of position. Now, the acquaintance theory, let's just ask with respect to the two theories that we're interested in, the acquaintance theory and the rationalist theory, we can ask whether the acquaintance theory will agree with this or whether the rationalist theory will agree with this. And the answer with respect to the acquaintance theory is that it will agree with this. It will entail this, at least if by introspective justification we mean the notion of propositional justification. And that's because The acquaintance theory will say that if you're in a conscious state, then of course you're acquainted with being in the state. And if you're acquainted with being in the state, then of course you'll have propositional justification to believe that you're in the state. So the acquaintance theory will certainly agree with the left to right direction here, that if you're in the conscious state, then you've got introspective justification. But I think it's also plausible to think that it'll agree with the right to left direction, depending, of course, on what introspective justification means. But you might think of introspective justification, and in fact this is a very natural way to think about it, you'd think that it depends on acquaintance in the relevant sort of way. That's what introspective justification would be on this sort of theory. And if you hold that theory, then if you have introspective justification to believe that you're in the state, then you're going to be in the state, because you'd have introspective justification only if you're acquainted with being in the state. And if you're acquainted with being in the state, then by the very theory, you're going to be in the state. So basically, the acquaintance theory looks as if it will agree with this claim. And if we think of this claim as a way of denying an appearance-reality distinction, which is, perhaps an exaggerated way to think about it, but nevertheless, if you think that this is a sort of thesis in the vicinity, then the acquaintance theory will agree with this. So in that sense, we can say that the acquaintance theory will deny an appearance-reality distinction. Now, it seems to me that this feature of the acquaintance theory is a bug, not a feature, if you like. It's a problem for the acquaintance theory that it has this consequence. I mean, from the left to right direction, if you're in a conscious state, then you've got introspective justification to believe that you're in the state. Remember, as I've said before, this will apply to the simplest creature. The simplest creature at all who is in a conscious state will, by this theory, have introspective justification to believe that they're in the state, even if they could never ever believe that they're in the state. So that seems to me an odd consequence of such a view, that you can be, since the simplest creature can be in a conscious state, theories of this kind will entail that for the simplest creatures, there's these epistemic claims that are true of them, and that seems like a very odd consequence. And from the right to left direction, where the idea is that if you've got introspective justification, then it's going to be true, that is to say, if you've got introspective justification to believe that you're in a conscious state, then you are in that state. That seems implausible also, because you might think, well, isn't it possible that you could have introspective justification to believe that you're in a certain state, and you're not? You've made some sort of an error. And on the acquaintance theory, that isn't the case. So the acquaintance theory will place this kind of limit on the possibility of ignorance and error with respect to introspection. At least, again, when we're focusing on these epistemic claims rather than on psychological claims. Now, when we look at the rationalist theory, things are different. So this is an important way in which the rationalist theory and the acquaintance theory are distinct, and I think actually an important way in which the rationalist theory is more plausible. So first of all, the rationalist theory will not agree that if you're in a conscious state, you will have introspective justification to hold the relevant belief. And that's because on this sort of theory, being in a conscious state on its own doesn't give you introspective justification, or in fact any sort of justification. What has to happen in addition is that you've got to abide by the relevant rule. You've got to have the kind of capacity that rational agents have in order to be justified in believing that you're in the state. And the reason for that is because you need to be disposed to form the justified belief, and you won't be disposed to form that belief merely by being in the conscious state. You also have to, this other condition has to be met. So it will not have it will not agree with the left to right direction of a claim like this. It won't agree that if you're in a conscious state, you've got introspective justification. And likewise, in the other direction, it will agree. It won't be true on this theory that if you have introspective justification, you will be in the relevant conscious state. And that's because the belief, here's a simple way to illustrate that. the belief in question, the one that you form, if you did form it, it could be formed as the outcome of a rational process. And in principle, a belief could be formed as the outcome of a rational process and therefore be justified and introspectively justified because it's the outcome of a rational process which involves your abiding by this particular introspection rule. So it's a case of introspective justification, but it could nevertheless be false. Well, are there such cases of false but introspectively justified belief? Well, Don Nordblom, who's our assistant in the course, has a nice paper in which he sets out some example. And the basic example that Nordblom is interested in that paper is one where time elapses in a certain case. So, for example, you're in a conscious state, you begin to form the belief that you're in the state. Perhaps you form it as a consequence of abiding by the introspection rule. I'm not sure that Don would go along with that exactly, but at any rate, we can certainly adjust what he says to this case. So you're in the conscious state, you begin to form the belief that you're in the conscious state. Well, forming a belief of that kind certainly takes time, and if it takes time, it's in principle possible that the initial conscious state could be removed or could dissipate or could go away or whatever. And if it did, then you would end up with a belief which was false, that you're in a certain conscious state, even though you arrived at the belief through a rational process. And in that case, you would have a belief that was justified, even though it was false. Now, you might say, well, this belief would be a doxastically justified belief. It's a belief that you hold which is justified, whereas we've been talking so far about propositionally justified beliefs, that is, being in a position to form a justified belief. But of course, the point would apply there too, because if you actually have formed a belief that is justified, well, you're clearly in a position to form such a belief. So you're propositionally justified as well, even though the belief is false. So certainly on this sort of theory, if we go back to a claim like this, S is in a conscious state C, if and only if S has introspective justification to believe that S is in the conscious state. A big difference between the acquaintance theory and the rationalist theory is that the acquaintance theory will agree with a thesis like this, at least if we understand introspective justification in a relevant kind of way, whereas the rationalist theory will not in both directions. And in that sense, we can say that the acquaintance theory will deny the appearance-reality distinction in a certain version, even though the rationalist theory will not. Okay, so let me summarize where we've got to so far. Well, so far I've looked at various different things you could mean when you deny, or what people might mean when they deny that there is an appearance-reality distinction. You might mean that Searle thing about, appearances being the reality. That seems to be more rhetoric than substance as far as anyone can see. More plausibly, you might think that you're in a conscious state if and only if you believe that you are, but neither of the two theories that I've been looking at say that. Or you might say you're in a conscious state if and only if you're introspectively justified to believe that you're in it. And as I've been saying, the acquaintance theory does endorse that, and so in a certain sense we might say it endorses a version of the denial of the appearance-reality distinction. But the rationalist theory doesn't. It permits the possibilities of ignorance and error here. Okay, but so that's an important fact about ignorance and error. But there's a related issue which has to do with what Timothy Williamson calls luminosity. And here the idea is that while the two theories that I've been talking about are different in the ways that I've been saying, they look to be similar in that they both entail that conscious states are what Williamson calls luminous. And the problem here is that luminosity is something that Williamson thinks doesn't exist. He thinks that he thinks he has an argument that no state can be luminous, and this will permit us to further investigate questions about ignorance and error. But as I'll get to at the end, I think it also shows something about the distribution of the properties that introspection represents. So let me begin to look at this argument. So there's really two ideas in Williamson's argument. The first idea is this idea about luminosity, and the second idea is an epistemological idea about safety, a safety requirement on knowledge. So let me explain luminosity first, and then look at safety, and then I'll present his argument. So Williamson explains what luminosity is in his own terminology, but I think it's sufficient for our purposes to think of it this way. On this way, a conscious state is luminous if and only if, in every situation in which you're in the state, you are in a position to know that you're in the state. So suppose that the conscious state is, having a pain in your foot. The idea of if it's luminous, then it'll follow that for every situation in which you have a pain in your foot, you'll be in a position to know that you have a pain in your foot. That's the idea here. So that notice that we're talking here about knowledge, and we're talking about being in a position to know something. What is it to be in a position to know something? Well, I think what the simplest way of thinking about that is that you're in a position to know just means that you will know given certain background conditions, given that certain background conditions are obtained or are met. Well, what background conditions? Well, it in order to connect the discussion of luminosity with our discussion, I think we can just assume that the conditions in question are the ones that we've already looked at in one form or another. So maybe it's being rational, it's mattering to you that you're in the state, you're capable of forming the belief that you're in the state, you're psychologically capable of forming that belief, and so on. So these are the sorts of conditions that we can think of. And so the idea is that if these conditions are met, then you will know. You might say that, on the face of it, it looks as if both the Acquaintance Theory and the Rationalist Theory, different though they are, entail that conscious states are luminous in this sense. We'll come back and see whether that's true, but on the face of it, that seems to be right, because they both seem to entail that if you're in a conscious state and these background conditions are met, then you will believe that you're in the state, and the belief will amount to knowledge, which sounds as if they are signing up for the view that if you're in the state, you're in a position to know that you're in the state, and that's what it is for the state to be luminous. Okay, that's one idea in the background of Williamson's argument. The other idea is this epistemological idea of safety. And the basic idea of safety is something like this. It's that if you know something, it's supposed to be a very general epistemological idea, if you know something in a certain situation, then the thing that you know must be true in every similar situation, or at least in a very similar situation. So if you, to bring this out, think of Goldman's famous fake barn case. In Goldman's example, you're in a strange situation in which there are lots of fake barns around, but there's also one or two real barns, not fake barns. And suppose that you're confronted with a real one. In that case, you might believe that you have a barn, not a fake barn, but a real barn in front of you, and your belief might be true, so you truly believe that you have a barn in front of you. But the intuition is that that belief in question isn't a case of knowledge. It's not literally true that you know that you have a barn in front of you, and that the usual explanation for that is that your belief could easily be false, which means it would have been false in a very similar situation. You could easily have been in front of a fake barn, not a real barn, and that's why it doesn't amount to knowledge. That's the intuitive idea behind a sort of safety consideration. Notice that safety is different from what is sometimes called factivity. Factivity just says that if you know that P in a certain situation, then P is true in that situation. That's not safety. Safety says if you know that P in a certain situation, then P must be true in a similar situation, not just in exactly that situation. So that's the idea, the very rough idea of safety. Okay, so now we've got two ideas, luminosity and safety, and now we can have a look at Williamson's anti-luminosity argument, and here's a sort of simplified version of the argument. I should say that my presentation of this argument, there are a lot of difficult issues here about exactly what luminosity is and what safety is and so forth. But I think the presentation that I've given so far is sort of sufficient for our purposes, even if not as careful as it might be. So here's the basic idea of the argument. Williamson makes two sort of suppositions. The first supposition is that you're in a case in which you wake up early, 6 a.m., let's say, and you feel cold. And what happens is over the morning, things gradually warm up until at 12 midday, let's say, you feel hot. So you wake up, you feel cold, there's a sequence of moments, and then you feel hot at the end of them, at the end of the sequence. So that's the first supposition. That can certainly happen, let's say. And the second supposition is that suppose that at each of these moments, all of the relevant background conditions that are involved in the notion of being in a position to know are met. So what were those conditions? Well, if we go back, to be in a position to know means that you will know, given the background conditions. And what are the background conditions? Well, at each moment you're rational, let's say. At each moment it matters to you whether you're in the relevant state. At each moment you're capable of forming the belief that you're in the state, and so forth. Just assume that that's the case. You can, if you like, think of it as you're attending to the question throughout the entire morning as to what state you're in. You've got nothing better to do for whatever reason. So all of the background conditions involved in being in a position to know are met. And the crucial point here is that if the background conditions for being in a position to know are met, then you do know. If you're in a position to know something, then that means that you will know it if the conditions are met. So if the conditions are met and you're in a position to know, then you will know. That's the general basic idea behind this second supposition. Okay, with those two suppositions in place, then we can reason as follows. At 6 a.m., at the initial time in the sequence of times, you'll know that you feel cold by luminosity. Why is that? Well, at 6 a.m. you do feel cold. That's just the first supposition. That's just entailed by the description of the case. And if luminosity is true, then you're going to be in a position to know that you feel cold, because luminosity says in every situation in which you feel cold, you're going to be in a position to know that you feel cold. And the second supposition says that the background conditions involved in being in a position to know are met throughout the sequence, so they're met at 6 o'clock. So that means that at 6 o'clock in the morning, you know that you feel cold. It's not just true that you do feel cold, it's also true that you know. That's our first premise, and we get that by luminosity plus the description of the case. Okay, second premise says, it's a conditional premise, and it says, if at 6 o'clock you know that you feel cold, then at 6:01, the very next moment, you will feel cold. Now, why do we think that's true? Why is that conditional true? Well, it's true because of safety. Safety says, if we go back to safety, safety says if you know that P in a certain situation, then P must be true in a very similar situation. Okay. So the idea is that the next moment after 6 o'clock is incredibly similar to 6 o'clock. So if you know something at 6 o'clock, then that thing will have to be true at 6:01, at the very next moment, because that very next moment is very similar to 6. Okay. Again, doesn't just turn on factivity. It's not that. It's obviously the case that if you know that you feel cold at 6 o'clock, then it'll be true that you feel cold at 6 o'clock. What this premise says is that if you know that you feel cold at 6 o'clock, then it'll be true that you feel cold at 6:01. That's what safety tells us. And from these two premises, we can, of course, conclude that at 6:01, you feel cold. So we've kind of proved by luminosity and by safety that if we assume that you feel cold at 6 a.m., then we can reason to the conclusion that you feel cold at 6:01 a.m. at the very next moment. Okay, well, why is this in any way interesting? Well, it's interesting because we can now repeat the reasoning, but starting not at 6 o'clock, but starting at 6:01. We can start at 6:01 that you feel cold. And if you feel cold, then by luminosity, you must know that you feel cold at 6:01. And by safety, if you know that you feel cold at 6:01, then you must be cold at 6:02. Okay, so you can see where this is going. So the idea is that we can repeat the reasoning for moment after moment, and then we will arrive inevitably at the conclusion that at 12 p.m. I feel cold, because we'll get to 11:59. I'll feel cold at 11:59. Then by luminosity, I will be in a position to feel cold. Then if the conditions are met, I'll know that I feel cold. And then by safety, if I know that I feel cold at 11:59, then I must be cold at 12 o'clock. Okay, but that's a contradiction. That's the contradiction, because in the description of the case, things gradually changed from 6 o'clock to 12 o'clock, and at 12 o'clock I felt hot, and if I felt hot, I do not feel cold. So we run into a contradiction. And what Williamson says is that safety, I mean, the sort of thumbnail version of the argument at any rate, is that safety is a feature of knowledge that we cannot give up. And since luminosity and safety lead to a contradiction, in this case, we must give up luminosity. So it's never true that, say, feeling cold is not luminous. I mean, in the background, Williamson is thinking that if any state is luminous, then feeling cold is luminous. I mean, if you don't like that state, you can choose some other one. But the idea is that this is, as it were, a kind of central case of a luminous mental state, and it isn't luminous according to this argument. So that's the sort of, incredibly clever argument that Williamson gives us. Okay, now Williamson's argument came out, 20 years ago now, and there's a lot of literature in responding to the argument. A lot of the literature goes into some pretty difficult epistemological issues. One discussion that's interesting is the one that focuses on the safety requirement. I gave a very, very simple version of the safety requirement, but it turns out that the safety requirement is difficult. There are different versions of it. There's in particular an exchange between, not an exchange, but a well-known paper by Searle and Burkert called Luminosity Regained. And then there's a reply much later by Amir Srinivasan. So that's a sort of one point to press about whether safety is right or whether it's been formulated correctly and so forth. Another response, which is in Declan Smithy's book, what Smithy's does is distinguish very sharply between epistemic and psychological readings of being in a position to know, saying that in the sort of second supposition here, suppose that at each moment all the background conditions are involved in being in a position to know are met. What Smithy says is that there's a sort of subtlety in what that amounts to, and if you attend to that, then the argument won't go through. And then there's an earlier kind of response, which I think was due mainly to Earl Coney, who said that we could concede that feeling cold isn't luminous, but we could insist that there are other states in the vicinity, like, for example, feeling extreme cold, which might be luminous. And the idea is that in the case of extreme cold, we couldn't tell a story about a sort of sequence of changes going from cold to hot. You can't quite tell that story in the case of extreme cold. So these are various suggestions, and I think if you held the acquaintance theory, you would have to say something along these lines. I think probably the best thing to do would be to go for the Smithy's proposal, mainly because the acquaintance theory and Smithy's own simple theory are actually quite similar on this sort of point. But what I wanted to, I'm not going to take up these proposals, but what I wanted to do is to point out that the rationalist view, the kind of view that I've been recommending, has another way of dealing with this argument. And the way that it would deal with this argument is by looking at the definition of luminosity and pointing out that there's just a slightly weaker way to understand it. So let's look again at the definition. So the one that I was operating with is this. A conscious state is luminous if and only if in every situation in which you're in the state, you are in a position to know that you're in the state. And that's crucial in the reasoning, actually, because you need to know, if you go back to the reasoning, at 6 o'clock you know you feel cold by luminosity. Why do we know that by luminosity? Well, we know by stipulation that you are cold at 6 o'clock. And the idea is that luminosity says that in every situation in which you are cold, you're in a position to know that you're cold. And then if the background conditions involved in being in a position to know are met, it will immediately follow that you know that you feel cold. So if we have the idea that in every situation in which you feel cold, then such and such, that will be true at 6 o'clock, because at 6 o'clock you feel cold. So that's a very important feature about the definition of luminosity. But notice that we could understand it in a slightly weaker way. And there are a number of ways to do this, but here's a somewhat straightforward thing to say. You could say, in addition to luminosity, we could distinguish the notion of Ceteris Paribus luminosity. Ceteris Paribus is the Latin phrase for other things being equal. So the idea is, we could say a conscious state is CP luminous, Ceteris Paribus luminous, if and only if, other things being equal, in every situation in which you're in the state, you're in a position to know that you're in the state. So the idea is that it's not true in every situation. It's only true other things being equal in every situation. Ceteris Paribus clauses are clauses which permit generalizations to be true, even though they have exceptions. Okay, that's what Ceteris Paribus clauses do. And so we can at least define a notion of Ceteris Paribus luminosity that's distinct from luminosity. And notice that Williamson's argument does not refute the idea that conscious states are CP luminous. It does refute the idea that they are luminous, at least it does if we go along with the reasoning. But it doesn't, even if you go along with the reasoning, refute the idea that conscious states are Ceteris Paribus luminous. And the reason for that is that if we go back again, a crucial move if we go back again and look at the reasoning, a crucial move in the reasoning is that we can repeat it at every moment. So that it must be true that at every moment that you feel cold, that state will be luminous. But if it's only true that feeling cold is Ceteris Paribus luminous, rather than being luminous in Williamson's sense, then it's a distinct possibility that somewhere along the line you will feel cold, and yet that situation in which you feel cold won't be one in which it is that you're in a position to feel cold, because feeling cold isn't luminous exactly, it's just Ceteris Paribus luminous, other things being equal luminous. And so I think Williamson's argument doesn't refute the idea that conscious states are Ceteris Paribus luminous, it only refutes the idea that they're luminous. Well, how does this help with the rationalist view? As I said, I don't think it helps much with the acquaintance view. I don't think the acquaintance view is in a position to exploit the difference between luminosity and Ceteris Paribus luminosity, because it seems to be committed to the idea that if you're in a conscious state, you're in a position to know that you're in it, and it's luminous in the strong sense that it applies in every situation, because in every situation you're in the conscious state, you'll be acquainted with the state. That just drops out of the theory. But let's think about the rationalist view in contrast. Well, at the heart of the rationalist view is this introspection rule that says if you're in a conscious state, then ... believe that you are. And that the way that we've been formulating that rule is that we haven't thought very much about the kind of implicit quantificational structure of a rule like that. And when you say you are in a conscious state, well, that means in a situation in which you're in a conscious state. Well, what is the notion of what kind of quantifier are involved here? Are we talking about every situation or not? Well, the rule could easily be interpreted to apply so that it's true in every situation in which you're in the state. So it could be the rule could be, if in every situation in which you're in the state, then ... believe that you are. And if that's the interpretation of the rule, then I think it's plausible that it would commit the rationalist theory to luminosity, and therefore would commit the rationalist theory to a position that's in the target range of Williamson's argument. But notice that it's possible here to interpret the rule in a slightly weaker way. We could interpret it so that it applies not to every situation in which you're in the state, but just every situation in which you're in the state, other things being equal. So we put in a Ceteris Paribus clause in the rule itself. If in every situation in which you're in a conscious state, other things being equal, believe that you are. And if that's the case, I think we would avoid the argument, because the argument does not in fact attack the notion of Ceteris Paribus luminosity. It only attacks the notion of luminosity. Now you might say, well, isn't this a sort of an ad hoc move? How is it in any way helpful? Well, that's a big topic. I won't try to address that here, but I will just make one observation. And I think the observation is quite interesting given the theories of introspection we looked at earlier on. And the observation is that the Williamson argument would refute not just theories like the Acquaintance Theory, let's say, or the Rationalist Theory, depending on how it's interpreted, but it would also refute a theory like the broad Perceptual Theory. So what's the broad Perceptual Theory? Well, the broad Perceptual Theory says that there's a kind of an empirical generalization that says that whenever you're in a conscious state, and maybe given certain background conditions, you'll believe that you are, and that belief will amount to knowledge. Or we could even understand the broad Perceptual Theory slightly differently, where we could just say directly that there's an empirical generalization that says that when you're in a conscious state and certain background conditions obtain, then you'll know that you're in that state. That's just an empirical claim at the heart of the broad Perceptual Theory. And Williamson's argument, I think, would refute that theory too. The interest in that is that theory is a kind of an empirical theory. It's not at least that particular part of the theory is an empirical theory, not a kind of philosophical theory of the kind that Williamson was mainly targeting. Why would Williamson's argument refute this view just as much as other sorts of theories? Well, just once we've noticed that we can define different notions of luminosity, it's easy enough to define another notion, which I'll call nomological luminosity. Nomological means having to do with the laws, the empirical laws. So here's how we might define nomological luminosity. It says, well, a conscious state is nomologically luminous if and only if, with respect to all nomologically possible worlds, in every situation in which you're in the state, you're in a position to know that you're in the state. What does with respect to all nomologically possible worlds means? It means thinking only of possible worlds where the empirical laws obtain. And since the empirical laws are contingent, there might be an outer sphere of possible worlds where these don't apply. But within the sphere of nomologically possible worlds, in every situation in which you're in the state, you're in a position to know that you're in the state. Now, in the version of the broad perceptual view that I was describing is committed to that, because it says that it's just a law, that it's a law that whenever you're in a state, a conscious state, you'll know that you are. So therefore, it will immediately follow that in all nomologically possible worlds, that means in all worlds in which the laws obtain, then in every situation in which you're in the state, you're in a position to know that you're in the state, or you do know that you're in the state if the background conditions are met. But then the argument would proceed as before, just restricting attention to nomologically possible worlds. It would tell you that no state could be nomologically luminous. not just that no state could be luminous outright, or that no state could be Ceteris Paribus luminous. It would tell you that no state could be nomologically luminous. And that's a sort of somewhat surprising result, because this looks like an empirical claim. I'm not saying here that that refutes Williamson's argument. I don't think it does, because Williamson's argument has some empirical premises in it as well, namely the idea that you can go through a sequence like this, going from warm to hot, is itself an empirical claim. But what's surprising about it is that that empirical claim plus certain epistemological premises will yield the result that this other apparently empirical claim, namely that there's a law about being in a conscious state and knowing that you are, they can't both be true together. And so that's a sort of a somewhat odd feature of Williamson's argument. Well, we might ask, well, how might we defend the broad perceptual theory against this? And I think the obvious thing to do is to adopt a kind of other things being equal reading of the law. So psychological laws don't typically have a kind of unrestricted form. They don't typically say, in any situation at all, if you're in a conscious state, then you know that you are. They usually have a kind of Ceteris Paribus clause built into them. This is a very typical feature of what are sometimes called special science laws, laws that don't apply, that are the laws of psychology or economics or something. And so the empirical generalizations here must be ones that somehow tolerate exceptions rather than are exceptionless. And if you say that, then you could avoid this problem for the broad perceptual theory in the same way that I just suggested you could avoid the same problem for the rationalist theory. And now the only point is that it now looks quite natural that we should avoid the luminosity argument in this way for the rationalist theory, just as we've just done it for the broad perceptual theory. And the reason is that if you're looking, if you think that empirical generalizations about psychology would have Ceteris Paribus clauses inserted into them, then the same thing would be true for general principles about rationality, which are sort of principles about rational psychology, if you like, rather than empirical psychology. Okay, so let me summarize where we've been so far. Like, I began by considering the idea that introspection is a representational system, and I've been looking at to the extent to which it permits ignorance and error, noting that the acquaintance theory and the rationalist theory look a bit different on that score. The rationalist theory permits ignorance and error easily. The acquaintance theory permits it in a certain sense, but does think that if you're in a conscious state, then you have a certain kind of justification for being in the state. We then looked at the Anti-Luminosity argument, and I was suggesting that we could avoid it by distinguishing luminosity in the sense that Williamson has in mind with a slightly closely related but a bit weaker notion, which I called Ceteris Paribus luminosity. And you might say that actually accepts Williamson's argument, and of course it does. It accepts the idea that the states aren't luminous, but it reinstates a certain related notion, namely that they're Ceteris Paribus luminous. Now, the interesting thing about this, if what I was just suggesting is right, is that it shows that the rationalist theory represents introspection as a representational system which is limited in the kind of distribution of conscious states. So it doesn't say something about, in every situation in which you're in a conscious state, you're in a position to know it. It only says, other things being equal, when you're in every situation, you're in which you're in a state, you're in a position to know, which is a weaker claim. And so in that sense, it's an illustration of the kind of limitation on a representational system that I mentioned. Within the last part of today's lecture, I want to turn to a question that bears on the other kind of limitation, the question about second-order properties, about the nature of the states that introspection represents. And that has to do with this issue about illusionism. So let me just begin by summarizing briefly what that is. So illusionism in the philosophy of mind is an idea that the basic idea is that you're not in conscious states, but you believe in introspection that you are. So this would be a kind of introspective error. You believe in introspection that you are in the state, but you're not in the state. And that, in a sense, is something that we can't rule out if we agree that we can make errors in introspection. And certainly the rationalist view permits that you can make errors in introspection, and indeed even the acquaintance theory can, in a certain sense, agrees that you can make errors in introspection. So that view can't be ruled out, at least not on that ground. And the attractive feature of illusionism is supposed to be that since you're not in conscious states, then there isn't a problem about fitting the conscious states that exist into the physical world. In the background is a sort of despairing attitude. The illusionist has a kind of despairing attitude about making the existence of consciousness compatible with a certain kind of physicalist view. If you're like me and you think, well, it's much less clear what the physicalist view rules in and rules out, and if indeed it rules out anything, then one has a somewhat different attitude about that. But in any case, the illusionist thinks that there is this major problem and we can solve the problem by denying that you're in conscious states. But their idea is that even if you're not in a conscious state, it can nevertheless be true of us that we believe in introspection, that we're in such states, which from the illusionist point of view is supposed to explain things like why we say all the time that we are, because we are under this introspective illusion. We have an introspective false belief that we're in a conscious state. And the illusion here is in some way supposed to be akin to ordinary perceptual illusions like the horizontal moon illusion, the idea that in ordinary perception the moon looks larger on the horizon than it does at the apex. Presumably it's not larger on the horizon than it is at the apex. So therefore that's a kind of an illusion. And the illusionist in the philosophy of mind wants to say the same thing about the illusion that we are in conscious states. And this theory has been developed by a number of people, mainly by Keith Frankish and Francois Camara and others as well, that I've put on the reading list. Now I think there's a sort of a very basic problem for a theory like that, and the theory and the problem comes out when you start to think about introspection in the way that we have. And here's the sort of, it's worth having this problem kind of clearly before us. The problem is that if illusionism is true, then there must be some property F, I don't know what that property is, which meets three conditions, A, B, and C. The first condition is that we believe by introspection that F is instantiated. The second condition is that F is not instantiated. And the third condition is that F is somehow essential to the mind-body problem. Now it's important to be aware that you need all of these three conditions on the property if illusionism is true. And the reason is that the first two conditions are just the illusion conditions. It's supposed to be an introspective illusion, so that means we believe by introspection that F is instantiated. Okay, but that's the first claim. But B, F is not instantiated, so those two things together tell us that we've got a kind of error in introspection. If you dropped either of them, then you wouldn't have if you dropped B, for example, and that F was instantiated, then you wouldn't have an error, so you wouldn't have a kind of illusion. And if you dropped A, then it wouldn't be an introspective illusion, and that's the crucial point in these theories. What about condition C? Well, condition C has to be in place because the whole point about illusionism, as I mentioned in the previous slide, since you're not in conscious states, there is no problem about fitting them into a physical world. And as I mentioned, illusionists are sort of driven by a kind of despairing attitude about that problem, about fitting consciousness into a physical world. Well, the name for that problem is the mind-body problem. And so the idea is that F has to be essential to the mind-body problem. It has to be the property that generates the mind-body problem. So there's got to be a property which satisfies, if illusionism is true, there must be a property that satisfies these three conditions, that we believe by introspection that F is instantiated, that F is not instantiated, and that F is essential to the mind-body problem. But I think the basic problem for illusionism, and this problem plays out in various ways, is that there isn't any such property. There's no property like this. There are properties that meet some of these conditions and fail others. There are there are properties that meet the first condition and perhaps the third condition, but don't meet the middle condition. And then there are properties that meet the middle condition but don't meet the other conditions. But there's no property, I think, that meets all of these conditions, and that's the problem for illusionism. So let me illustrate this a bit. Well, suppose we begin with what you might think is a clearly introspectable property, like the property of being in pain, or the property of having a pain in your foot, or something like that. Nobody thinks that that isn't a introspectable property. That's the sort of paradigm example of an introspectable property. So let's suppose that F is that property, the property of being in pain. Well, if we go back and we plug that in, well, do we believe by introspection that being in pain is instantiated? Yes, we do. We sometimes believe by introspection that we're in pain. So A is all right. Let's look at C. Is being in pain is essential to the mind-body problem? Yes, that seems a plausible thing to say. We can always run the constitutive arguments of the mind-body problem, like the conceivability argument that we looked at in the lecture on Revelation. Being in pain is a property that does seem to be essential to the mind-body problem. But now, if B is true, then being in pain is not instantiated. But that's absurd. So the problem for this proposal about what F could be, namely the property of being in pain, is that while both A and C are true, while it's both true that we believe in introspection that pain is instantiated, and that's central perhaps to the mind-body problem, that property, the idea that there aren't any, that property isn't instantiated is crazy. It entails that nobody feels pain. And in fact, illusionists don't typically say that outright. They typically say that they don't want to deny that people feel pain. They only want to deny that people feel pain according to some theory of feeling pain. Again, they don't often say that it's not true that people are conscious. It's only that people are not conscious according to some theory of what consciousness consists in. So they don't want to deny outright that people don't feel pain. So the property F can't be the property of being in pain. Well, at this point we might imagine a sort of a more, what you might think of as a more theory-laden property, a more recherché or more sophisticated or difficult to understand property, not the property of being in pain, but perhaps, the property of being acquainted with a sense datum. So if you remember when talking about Revelation, I was describing the sense datum theory, which I think of as a false theory, but a historically important one. And according to that theory, being in pain is being acquainted with a sense datum. Well, even if we don't agree with that identity, one can think of the property of being acquainted with a sense datum. Or again, one could think of the property of being in a state that satisfies the principle of revelation, or the identification thesis, as Lewis called it. Well, that's a highly theory-laden view about a property, but we can certainly define properties of that kind. So we can ask whether illusionism is true with respect to properties of that kind. And I think once again we arrive at the view that those three claims aren't all true. Now, if we go back, what are the three claims again? We believe by introspection that F is instantiated. Well, suppose we think of F as being acquainted with the sense datum. Then illusionism will be the thesis that we believe by introspection that being acquainted with the sense datum is instantiated, that being acquainted with the sense datum is not instantiated, and that being acquainted with the sense datum is essential to the mind-body problem. Well, we might agree now that B is true, that is, it's true that being acquainted with the sense datum is not instantiated, but the claim that we believe in introspection that it is instantiated, or that it's essential to the mind-body problem, in other words, claims A and C, aren't plausible at all. It's not plausible to think that we believe by introspection that being acquainted with the sense datum is plausible. And we saw this in a way going through the topic of revelation. So remember I said it's just implausible to think that that even if you were acquainted with the sense datum, you could come to know that by introspection, because that would be a case of coming to know it without having any evidence for it. But that's the kind of thing about which you'd need a lot of evidence. And so it's just not plausible that introspection represents that. In introspection, we are represented as having that sort of property. And likewise, I think it's not plausible that the mind-body problem presupposes properties of this kind. I think what's interesting about the mind-body problem is that all you need is very simple properties like being in pain. You don't need these very, very recherché properties like being acquainted with a sense datum or being in a state that satisfies revelation. And so the mind-body problem, I think, doesn't presuppose these kinds of theory-laden properties. So you can see there's a sort of a dilemma here for the illusionist, namely that the question is, can we believe that there's a property which satisfies these three conditions? We believe by introspection that it's instantiated, that it's not instantiated, and it's essential to the mind-body problem. As I said, the basic problem seems to be that there's no such property. If you think of ordinarily in introspectable properties, like being in pain, A will be plausible, but B will not be plausible. C will be plausible, but B again will not be plausible. But if you think of really complicated properties like being acquainted with a sense datum, then B might be plausible, but A and C won't be plausible. Now, there's a way in which the illusionist might deal with this objection, and that is they might draw a distinction between what we can call aided and unaided introspection. The phrase aided and unaided I take from David Armstrong, who used that in the context of perception. And here's the basic idea. I mean, suppose you believe by introspection that F, some property, is instantiated. And suppose that you, in addition to that, hold some theory according to which F is G. You hold a theory according to which F is G. Then, of course, you could infer that G is instantiated. So if you come to know by introspection that you instantiate the property of being F, and you think independently that F is G, then you could infer that G is instantiated. So suppose, as an example, I believe by introspection that being in pain is instantiated. In other words, I come to believe by introspection that I am in pain. Now suppose I hold a particular theory according to which being in pain is being acquainted with a sense datum. Suppose, for example, I'm one of those sense datum theorists from the 20th century. Then I could infer that being acquainted with a sense datum is instantiated. I put in my introspective knowledge together with this theoretical claim together, and I arrive at the view that I am in fact acquainted with a sense datum. Now you might say, well, do I know that I'm acquainted with a sense datum? Do I believe that I'm acquainted with a sense datum by introspection or not? Well, it's not unaided introspection, because it's introspection aided by theory. So it's a case of aided introspection, you might say. So we can draw this distinction, or some distinction in this vicinity, between aided and unaided introspection. And you might think that the illusionist can appeal to this, because they could say, well, what about we have this version of our view, namely that there is a property F such that we believe by aided introspection that F is instantiated, and F is not instantiated, and F is essential to the mind-body problem. So now suppose F again is, being acquainted with a sense datum. So then the idea is, well, if I could believe by aided introspection that F is instantiated, that seems quite plausible as long as I believe in the background, the sense datum theory, then I would believe by aided introspection that being in pain, but that I'm acquainted with the sense datum and that property is instantiated. It remains the case that that property is not instantiated. Let's suppose that the sense datum theory isn't true. All we need then is the claim that that property is essential to the mind-body problem. Well, is this a reasonable position for the illusionist to take? Well, I don't think so, for two reasons. One is that this is what Frankish at any rate calls weak illusionism. Weak illusionism is just the thesis that we have false beliefs about what our mental states consist in. It doesn't seem to be surprising that we would have such false beliefs. This is an example. So this is a case of weak illusionism, not illusionism strictly so called. And moreover, it remains the case that C is false in this version of the view, even if it's true that A and B are correct, or at least if we can agree that A and B are correct. So I don't think that we can appeal to aided introspection to deal with this problem. Okay, so let me summarize. Well, today I've been looking in a kind of general way at the idea that introspection is a representational system. And I started off by noting that any representational system will presumably permit error and ignorance, though different systems might put some constraints on that. And I also noted some limitations that are typically built into representational systems, namely that they represent only some properties and not others, that they represent only some distributions of those properties and not others, and they represent only certain features of the natures of those properties and perhaps not others. And what I've been trying to do is to look at these three areas, namely the issue of denying the appearance-reality distinction, the Anti-Luminosity argument, and this issue about illusionism, to try to illustrate the way in which, according to these different theories, Acquaintance Theory and the Rationalist Theory, that introspection has these properties. And so what we saw is that if you think of introspection this way, then it does permit error and ignorance. And in fact, on the rationalist view, it permits kind of more possibilities of ignorance and error than on the acquaintance view, though both do in fact permit those possibilities. I also looked at the anti-luminosity argument, and I pointed out that the rationalist view at least has a certain way of dealing with that argument. And the way of dealing with that argument said that, well, even if mental states or conscious states are not luminous, they might be other things being equal luminous. And that, in a sense, puts a constraint on the kind of distribution of conscious states that the state can represent. It doesn't represent for every case in which you're in a conscious state, you're in it only for other things being equal. And then finally, in the discussion of illusionism, there the issue was whether the theory represents just being, whether in introspection you represent just that you're in pain, or that you're in pain according to particular theories, like the sense datum theory. And we thought about that as distinguishing different properties. Do you represent that you're in pain, or do you represent that you're acquainted with the sense datum, and so forth? And what I was trying to illustrate was that this creates a big problem for the illusionist, because the illusionist wants to say that there is a property which meets three conditions. You have to represent in introspection that you have that property, that the property is instantiated, that the property isn't instantiated, and that the property is crucial in the mind-body problem, or is essential to the mind-body problem. And the problem is that there really isn't such a property, because the more theoretically laden you make the property, the less likely it is that introspection does represent you as being in that property. It just won't be one of the target properties of introspection. Or again, it won't be, if you think about it as a second-order information about being in pain, the introspection won't represent you, won't represent those features. But if you just operate with much simpler cases like being in pain, then it will be very plausible that introspection represents you as being in that state. But then the denial that you're in that state, which is what the illusionist needs to say, isn't very plausible. Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, the sort of themes in this particular lecture are pretty rich. There's lots of issues here about representational systems and so forth. There's lots of issues underlying the appearance-reality issue, certainly underlying the anti-luminosity issue, and certainly underlying the illusionism issue. And I don't think that we've done any much more than just scratch the surface. There's lots and lots of things to say. Well, I'm going to remain at the surface pretty much, but next time I will look a little bit more at the issue of illusionism, in particular look at some work from Martina Needle-Rumelin, which is a kind of criticism of illusionism. So I will see you next time.